Hey, this is Carl, also known as Zarepath in the Custom Magic community, and I'm here today to talk about 2020, this next year of Custom Standard. We're talking about custom magic cards, custom magic sets, custom magic format, custom standard. We have a new set coming in. It's Stoom by Ruben Covington. We also have several sets that are already in Custard are changing a lot of things, a lot of their cards. And so I thought now would be a good time to look at what are 10 exciting new cards, 10, you know, I say new, but include some redesigned old cards that I think are going to affect the format in interesting ways or could be interesting to build around. So let's get into it. Um, Number 10, I have Blazing Offerings. Now, Blazing Offerings is in Scriptures of Urshot. It's not a new set to the format. This was previously a 3 mana deal 5 with some conditional upside if you sacrificed a creature. And that was just a little too much for red to want to kill not every creature, and it also didn't go face. So this is a new design. It fills, the obvious comparison is Lava Coil, right? 2 mana, deal 4 to any creature, sorcery speed with some upside to it. Being able to exile something is pretty good upside. Graveyard mechanics are very common. There's definitely some in custom standard now, some cards that have good death triggers that you want to exile instead of um, just killing them. But I think the upside of being able to destroy Planeswalker is much better. Um, that's just that will clear a lot of different Planeswalkers. And if we look at the rest of the removal suite that we have in custom standard right now, in red in particular, we have Shock. That can go face, and it's an instant, and it only costs one, but it only deals half as much damage. And there's just too much stuff that doesn't kill. Hired Hit is a little bit better, but you have to be able to toss a card from your hand, and not every kind of deck wants to do that generally. But it's sometimes a lightning bolt. But even then, Blazing Offerings can deal a little bit more damage. It doesn't go face. That is one drawback, I guess. Wander the Unknown is, I think, the premier removal in the format, just because it's cheap enough. It has the right speed. It's instant speed, and it's exiling. It is path to exile for 2 mana, so like it does give them the ability to ramp. But that's it's not as terrible as you'd think it would be. Um, but Blazing Offerings is different enough. It doesn't exile, but it does hit Planeswalkers, which Wander doesn't, and it's red. So I just really like red having this new good cheap removal that can hit stuff with more than 3 toughness. It's more likely to deal with a Planeswalker. Black has this very aggressive removal, but it does have a downside in that they can scry one, which is oftentimes a much bigger downside than you'd expect. And then they have Out of Date, which is kind of a Doomblade, except that non-artifact creature and unequipped, like those two conditions, actually are more limiting than you would think. So let's look at some of the things it kills. I mean, Eli's very strong planeswalker in the format, can run away with games. Blazing Offerings can kill it after a +1. Talia has been the center to many very powerful decks in the most recent rotation, and can kill Talia after a +1. Tohanga doesn't see a lot of play, but he's very strong in the decks that he's in. I think when somebody plays Tohanga, they usually use the 0 um, for the haste and indestructible body that he brings. But then, Blazing Offerings deals with that. Deals with must answer creatures like Unproven Hatchling once it's hit Prestige and has become a 4/4, or Sign of Empires. If they've got this 4/4 flying lifelinker uh, and you're a red deck, that's often not great for you, right? Uh, and that can answer that, or answer very common creatures like Tempered Ankulin, which are just in so many decks because they're so versatile and obviously can be cast in any of those decks because of mana requirements. Sporeflow Protector has been kind of annoying to try and remove because it can always make itself bigger. Not always, but it can often hold up mana to make itself bigger to kind of get out of range of your red removal. And this makes it more likely that you can do that. So they either have to hold up more mana, uh, you know, or they just won't be able to. And then Shemesh is another aggressive red-green body that is just so big and red decks normally can't deal with, but this could. All right, so number 9 card I'm excited for that's new to the format is Lani from Rakoa. Mulan is a complete redesign. She was more aura focused before and just wasn't seeing play, wasn't a great design. And this is a much more generalized Planeswalker design. Uh, Other people have not been as convinced that Wulani is very strong. I think she is incredibly strong. And I'm just going to look at some other similar cards. So you just look at her +1. She can put a counter on any creature. If you put it on the enemy creature, though, they can't attack you for a turn. So very versatile. It feels like a big downside to be making their creatures bigger just to delay them attacking you. But there's ways to mitigate that, and I think that leads to some of the most broken things you can do with her, but I'll get to that in a minute. The -2 might just be the best mode on her, just being able to get a 2/2 creature immediately. And then again, the following turn reminds me of some other very powerful cards from Wizards, which is History of Benalia, right? Where that gives you 2 bodies over 2 turns as well that are 2/2s. Those have Vigilance, and then it has a different upside, right? This big explosive turn of Knights that gives you really good attacks. Um, and I'm not saying Wulani is better or even as good as History of Benalia, but it is a comparison worth making, right? You're doing similar things with Wulani. You can make, creatures. You can then make them bigger, then make another creature the following turn. The upsides are different. Wulani is better in a much longer game. Wulani can be better defensively against one giant threat. And then there's also the threat of ultimate later. Now, Johnny Collar of the Pride is another very good comparison because it's another 3-mana walker with 4 loyalty with a +1 of putting a counter on one of your creatures. So Johnny's +1 is obviously strictly worse here. It doesn't have the flexibility that Wulani has. And then you look at the -3. You understand how that works with the Johnny's kit, right? You make one of your creatures bigger, and then on the turn that you want to win, you can give that big creature flying and double strike. But that's basically, you're only using that when you want to win the game. Otherwise, you're just kind of, plunking plunking counters on your creatures, I should say. A Johnny requires you to have other creatures to be good at all. Lani, however, makes her own creatures. She can make herself a creature that she can then put counters on, which means she can, just by virtue of that, go in many more decks. And that's even ignoring that the +1 is, more flexible than a Johnny's. Another Planeswalker worth looking at is Jace, another 3-mana walker with a -2 that makes a 2/2. The Wizards thought that was strong enough that they had to give the 2/2 a drawback, and it takes up a lot more of Jace's loyalty, proportionally. Jace's loyalty abilities are a little funky in that Jace is also designed to be copied, right? And if there's copies of Jace, the abilities can't be quite as strong because they need to design that maybe multiples of these could be activated in a single turn. But one thing I did see, when Jace was played, and it wasn't for long, he was almost always just -2 immediately for the 2/2, and that went a long way to protecting him and to furthering the board while still giving you a win condition. And I think Wulani can do that. Then the last comparison I want to make is Kiora, the Crashing Wave. She was not played a lot, but there was something very strong about her play pattern, and that was that her +1 protects her and ramps her up to her ultimate. And a lot of games were lost, at least in limited and in other formats where Kiora was in play, just by her +1ing the enemy creatures until she could ultimate, and then you get Krakens forever. Wulani can do the same thing. If you're only worried about a single creature, you can just keep putting counters on it, and then blocking their smaller stuff with warrior tokens or whatever other little guys you have lying around. The thing about Kiora's colors, though, is that blue-green is not a color that can then make up for the fact that you haven't been that you're not removing the creature that you're scared of, right? Wulani can +1 those creatures and then remove them later with a Wander the Unknown or a Board Sweeper or something. So I think that kind of play pattern of plus one-ing until you can then get to an ultimate, I think is inherently better with Lani, who has ways to clear the board in her colors much better than blue-green does, and also has better ways to remove the creature that she's temporarily putting at bay, whereas in blue-green you have to kind of outrace them in size or card advantage, which is a little more indirect and less reliable. And so I just wanted to look at other cards that you can follow up with after Lani. If you are just trying to abuse the +1 and kind of shut down one of their creatures, if you follow up Lani with an equalizer here, L3T, and the thing about Ulani's +1, if you use it defensively, that's going to make them want to swarm the board. And as they put more creatures in play, that's going to make them be susceptible to L3T's -2. They're going to have to sacrifice a creature, and then you can put the counter on the one they didn't sacrifice, and you're still safe. Similarly, board wipes are great with this, right? You know, you keep putting counters on their stuff, they have to commit more forces to the board to actually be a threat against you, and then you use Level the Landscape to punish them for having so much power on the board, which is really cruel because you're the one giving them that power with Wulani's +1. And it also is a neat card that has some flexibility of finding a plains if you need it, which isn't nothing if you're running a one white card there. And then Wrath of Mod is just a more traditional board wipe. It comes down immediately after Wulani, although I suspect if you want to do Wulani into board wipe, you want a +1 a few times, then Wrath of Mod or Level Landscape, then +1, you know, whatever they play after that, and then hit a -7. So those were just two cards I wanted to look at from other sets that have changed cards that are already in existence, or you know, sets that are already in the format. The rest I wanted to devote to Vestoom because this is a set we haven't played with and constructed at all yet, so I wanted to kind of highlight those more. And there's a lot of stuff that I'm really excited about in Vestoom. A lot of which I'm not even mentioning here. They've got really cool mutant offerings that work well with the mutant tribal stuff in Metropolis. There's some really interesting and cool black-red aggro tools and creatures that I didn't get into here on this list. Again, the list is subjective, but I'm really excited about all the stuff in this list, and I think it will all have a big impact on the format. So Wall of Mysteries and Growth Blazers, I'm kind of cheating by putting two cards into one slot here, but that's because they fill similar roles, and we can kind of look at them and talk about them in a pair here, and that they have tremendous ETB value. When they enter the battlefield, you get something of great value here. Wall of Mysteries, you know, just a color shift of Wall of Omens, and then Growth Blazers is kind of based on another very familiar design in Wizard's Magic, which is Coiling Oracle, except it costs one more and a little bit more power and toughness. So both of these really good ETB abilities. Let's talk about them one at a time. Wall of Mysteries, like I said, copy of Wall of Omens. Wall of Omens is really good. It sees play in modern control decks. It can be blinked for great value. Just the fact that it gives you card advantage and stops aggression at the same time at such a low mana cost is very strong, and just is such a tempo loss for so many aggro decks. Like they just can't deal with a 4 toughness body and then also overcome the card advantage that you get against them. Interestingly, you know, Wall of Mysteries is a color shift of Wall of Omens. Festoom also brings a color shift from the other direction, from blue to white, of Ghostly Flicker with Survey the Ruins, which I'm just going to throw in here just because of that interesting pattern, but it also works really well with Wall of Mysteries, you know, obviously being a great blink target, but it can also exile your lands if you want, or your planeswalkers. You can reset your planeswalkers with Survey the Ruins, which is what makes it a little bit stronger than Ghostly Flicker. Ghostly Flicker didn't see play in its standard, but it obviously has been incredibly strong in Pauper. So, you know, power levels of different formats differ depending on what's going on. So this is a card I would look at also, particularly with all of the blink targets, the great blink targets that we have in the format now. So looking at Growth Blazers, you slam this on 3. It's a 2/3 that gets you value, which is pretty good. Historically, cards that are fairly on rate, power and toughness wise, that also give you card advantage have a good chance of seeing play in Custard or in standard formats. Let's look at other versions. We have Coiling Oracle. Um, One thing to realize is this classic Coiling Oracle ability, it's strictly better than drawing a card, because if it were just draw a card and you drew the land, what's better, having that land in your hand or in play untapped, ramping you? And then if it's not a land, then it's just as good as drawing a card. So 3 mana, 2/3, doing better than drawing a card, that's a lot of value. Coiling Oracle's body, though, doesn't do a lot for you. It can chump something, you can sacrifice it for some other synergy, you can blink it, right? But really, you're not using it for the body, you're using it for the ability. The fact that this also has a body is similar to Wall of Mysteries in that you're getting great card advantage and good synergies and values from it, but um, it can also brawl, right? It can also block some 2/2s, it can, and survive. It can even trade with some more aggressive stats like a 3/2 for 2 mana or something, which is good. It also reminds me of Risen Reef because that's a 3 mana value engine creature, but this is, more of an engine, right? Where Growth Blazers is not really an engine; it's just a value creature with synergies with its tribe of elementals, and its land doesn't enter untapped. But if you've played an arena at all, you see these Risen Reef decks get really out of control. So it's not the same power level as Risen Reef, I don't think. This isn't something you can build around. And something that we actually have in Custard right now is Irrigation Trawler. And let's just look at the comparison. It comes down 1 mana earlier, which matters a lot at that stage in the game. It also has 3 toughness, but it doesn't trade the stuff as easily. You're never going to attack a control player down to a meaningful life total with this. And it's worse than a draw here. If it's only a draw if it's a land. If not, you put that card back and you get a petal. So Irrigation Trawler either ramps you or finds you a land. It's a lot more one-dimensional. Whereas Growth Blazers is good no matter what happens. Uh, so I could totally see this seeing play. It could be quite good. The thing about Growth Blazers and Wall of Mysteries is there's heavy competition for blink targets. We already have an Elvish Visionary type creature. We already have a 3 mana 2/2 draw card, ETB in blue. Um, we have a Tempered Anklem, which we saw earlier, which can either deal 3 or gain 3, depending on what you want to do. And so those are the main things that I would see preventing them from seeing play if they didn't see play. But we just have so many great blink engines. Um, I'd be surprised if they didn't see play somewhere. And even outside of blink decks, obviously Wall of Mysteries is going to be wonderful in control decks. So Talia's Planeswalker I showed earlier, talking about what Blazing Offerings can kill. Talia used to be 3 mana. She's being pumped up to 4 just because, that proved to be very strong. I think she's still very strong. Being able to blink something every turn is very good in decks that you build around her with. And the -2 gives you just a lot of card advantage if you are bringing back something. Like if you don't hit your land drop, it's basically a free divination. Lazer's Conjuring is one blink ability that gets totally out of control in the format right now. Uh, you're usually casting this for, even if you just cast it for 3, that can do a lot. If you have a single Tempered Ankulum and you cast this for 6 mana, X equals 3, you could deal 9 damage to them out of nowhere. You could gain yourself 9 mana if you need to. Because it's the way it's written, you can blink the same thing repeatedly. This card can do a lot with very little. And then Witch of Shifting Waters has the Spirit mechanic from the Erelu set, which is this card can be cast cheaper if you if you kind of like O-ring one of your own creatures under it. So if you have a 3 mana creature like, say, Growth Blazers, this would cost just 1 blue mana. And it would enter the battlefield. You'd clone anything, clone something they have, clone something else you have. And then if your clone is ever removed, that card you had O-rings, in this case the Growth Blazers, would enter the battlefield and get their ETB value again. The interesting thing about Witch is the way it's written is it can be a copy of any creature on the battlefield, including itself. Well, it's a 0/0, which means that sometimes you can cast this for just a blue mana, and essentially flicker whatever you were inspiriting with it. And so Witch of Shifting Waters has a lot of really funky uses. It has led to some infinite combos in previous rotations where there were, a little more broken stuff going on with the ETB and leave the battlefield stuff. But that's another great card for flicker decks. And then I mentioned Survey the Ruins. I have to think that this could be good somewhere, just because it being strictly better than Ghostly Flicker seems like something worth testing. All right, so we're done talking about those value creatures and flicker targets. Let's look at Lethal Dose. This is kind of a staple card. We talked a little bit about removal before with Blazing Offerings. We're going to do the same thing here with Lethal Dose. This is... It looks... Okay, here's the thing. It technically has a downside of the thing you kill has to have CMC of 4 or less. A lot of times in Standard, unless you're playing a cheaty deck or a ramp deck, that's not a downside at all. And so it's essentially exile target creature planeswalker at instant speed for 1 BB. It's Hero's Downfall with upside. However, for those matchups where they are cheating something big into play, or they're ramping into something, or they have a control finisher that's just huge, this becomes a dead card. So it still has some texture to it, but it's good enough in all the other matchups. Like, it's just so much better than the other things black has that it's still wonderful. And there are not a lot of good planeswalkers of converted mana cost 5 or more. So I think just for being able to kill planeswalkers, this card is great. We talked about Blazing Offerings as another card that can kill planeswalkers. When we looked at Wulani, one of her strengths was she has 4 starting loyalty and pops right up to 5 immediately, getting out of Blazing Offerings range. Well, Lethal Dose could deal with her. Wander the Unknown, another good exile instant speed removal spell, but it can't hit planeswalkers. And then Banish. Banish is what we've been using to get rid of planeswalkers. I think this is the most main deckable planeswalker removal except for our O-rings or Oblivion Ring variants. Banish has really cool upside, but it's just so expensive at 4 mana. And there's decks that want to interact more to instant speed, and I think Lethal Dose will be a great boon to control decks for that reason. The Stoom is doing some really interesting things mechanically in the set. One of them is that it is reintroducing C, or the colorless mana symbol. And that is mana that has to be colorless mana. Mana produced by something that only produces colorless mana. It's kind of a 6 color, not strictly, but it operates that way. And it makes many lands better. So for example, right now in the format we have fetch lands. They're kind of slow, right? If you fetch for something, then that land's going to enter tapped. But in the meantime, if you're also using some of these C cards, this might even be better to not crack, and you could use it to tap out for Ether Conductor, and then if you actually need to play something with color, you can go find your lands. Ether Conductor, there's several, fairly pushed, constructed C creatures. They're all artifact creature construct, so they have some artifact synergies. There's a little bit of construct synergy with a lot of cards in Metropolis. There's a lot of constructs in it, a lot of artifact creatures, a lot of constructs that care about artifacts entering the battlefield. And so I could see maybe there being a construct deck. But this is the example I like because it really encourages you to commit to C as a second color in an aggressive deck. So like a green C aggro deck or black C aggro deck that you have a bunch of creatures that you want to be able to cheat into play, which means they have to be fairly low CMC just to start going up the ladder. And this is just such a powerful payoff for that. I would be surprised if this didn't see play in some kind of deck. I don't know if it'd be the best deck. That's hard to tell, right? Because we haven't seen the C decks. But I'm really excited to see how they work. No pun intended. All right, number 5, Cepheus's Research. This is a tutor. We have an interesting history of tutors in Custom Standard. Recently, we had a 1 mana tutor that found any enchantment, but you could only play it that same turn. And that led to some really weird stuff in the meta where a lot of decks just had enchantment toolboxes that were just very easily thrown into their decks. And there were just enchantments everywhere, and people finding enchantment combos that you'd normally never be able to find otherwise. So, when I see a cheap tutor, 2 mana, that can find any colorless card, I think this could be strong somewhere, somehow, at least in a specific deck. It's a very interesting card in both its cost, its additional cost, as well as its effect, and they work together in an interesting way. The cost is that you have to waste a couple lands. This is one of the main mechanics of Stoom. When you waste a land, it just turns into a waste, which means that it can't tap for any color of mana anymore except for sea, which works well with the sea cards, right? Um, and if you're finding a colorless card, it's likely an artifact or a land, and those don't care about what colors of mana your lands can produce. So it becomes an interesting artifact tutor. The thing about wasting is it hurts you more than you would think. If you then, I mean, you're going to have some amount of blue cards in your deck if you're running Cepheus's Research because, it is a blue card. And so wasting all of your land so early can be a very risky thing to do. It curves directly into one of my favorite C cards, which is a Thanos Conservator. Um, so if on 2 you go find this guy, you can kind of make up for the tempo you lose by, uh, spending a turn tutoring for something to then immediately remove one of their creatures or pull something from their hand that would be problematic for your strategy. So that's one possible target. I mentioned lands. It's interesting that you can kind of hurt the mana of your lands in play, but then go find a land that would fix that problem if you're not hitting your land drops and it's that important to you or whatever. Um, this is a kind of a cute thing that I'm not sure is very good, but you can use Cepheus's Research to find Supercomputer, which cares about tutoring for things. And so if you draw more Cepheus's Researches, you can use those to trigger the supercomputer and get card advantage. And then there were the fetch lands I showed earlier. Those are natural ways to trigger supercomputer as well. You can use it to find control finishers like Karn, who's a really big, colorless, expensive planeswalker in Vestum, and a lot of other fun things as well. So Cepheus's Research, I think, can lead to some interesting toolbox packages in the right deck. Claim What Remains is such a Johnny card. I love Johnny cards, and this has some interesting safeguards built into it. Well, first of all, let's look at it. You discard a land card, and that gives you a red mana. Okay, so it's a ritual that you can use whenever you want, as long as you have the land cards to spare. That also gives you some card advantage. You exile the top card of your library, and you can play it that turn. The problem is that, well, before we talk about the problem, let's talk about why that marriage is wonderful. What most Storm decks want to do is to do rituals, create free mana, and draw cards with that, while still keeping a little bit of mana left over, so you can use that mana for more rituals, which you can then use for more drawing cards. You end up drawing your whole deck, having tons of mana, and then you do something ridiculous. Claim What Remains does both of those things at once in one card, as long as you can satisfy the condition of having land cards to discard. Well, if you're drawing lots of cards, you should be able to, have some surplus of land cards you can use to keep your storm going. But the safeguard that's in this card is that when you do this, the card advantage you're getting through Claim What Remains does not put those cards in your hand. So it doesn't give you, if you're exiling land cards, you can't put them in your hand to then discard to keep fueling your combo. So you kind of have to build around it in very specific ways. You have to have ways to get land cards into your hand while you're storming off. And one of the cards that I think would be great for that is Cradle of Civilization. It's just a really good card. You're never going to be embarrassed running that in the main of most decks. It fetches you a land when you play it, and it fixes your mana, which is important if you know you're only producing red here, and this is a green card. So you could play Cradle, um, find a land, discard that for a red, and basically it becomes a free cycler as long as you can fix your mana appropriately. And then I was thinking, is there any way to take advantage of all of these land cards you're going to be discarding? Like, what if you're not comboing off in a single turn? What if this is more of uh, a value thing, right? Like maybe you're even ramping a little bit. You're discarding land cards, giving yourself a little bit of extra mana to then, either play the land card that you found or maybe play something worth casting that turn. And I thought, Choking Dunes. This is a card I've had my eye on for a bit. It's from Scriptures of Urshad. It can win games out of nowhere. It can, blast big things off the board if you have enough land cards in your graveyard. And it can be a way to win if you're using a Claim What Remains value engine. And then Reuben Covington, the designer of Claim What Remains, we were talking about ways to break it. Um, and he's tried. And he's convinced it's not an eminently breakable card just because of the safeguard he has in it. But the synergies are very interesting to me still, and it might still be quite powerful. Sacrificial Bull was his idea, in that it cares about there being lands in the graveyard, right? And so if you're running fetch lands, and there's a red-green fetch land duel, so that already works with this package we're looking at here, um, you can start building up your Sacrificial Bull. And if you're in a combo build, you get to a point where you're out of land cards, you can sacrifice your Bull, draw a bunch of cards, maybe get some more lands for you to discard. Or this can be, the way that you pay off all the land cards you're discarding from your engine just to make a big beater you can attack with. So just a lot of interesting ways you can build around Claim What Remains. I'm almost certain that I'm not thinking of the best way to do it, but these are interesting things to look at for Claim What Remains. A card that I'm very excited to see if it can be broken. Number 3 is Find of a Lifetime. This is a card that Sol Invictus identified. I believe it was him. Someone identified this card as just being incredibly strong, stronger than you think when you first read at it. I read it and I was like, okay, it's a 5-mana wheel. I mean, maybe it's better that you're getting, a bunch of non-land cards instead of just land cards, but I wasn't convinced. But the more they talked about it, the more I realized actually that's very good. It's like better than a draw 7 because at that point in the game, you can't play all your lands in the same turn. So the more cards you draw, the worse it is to have you know, any plural amount of lands in there. And guaranteeing they're not going to draw any lands, you're only going to draw gas, and a lot of it all at once is very, very good. Now again, there's a couple, well, I mean, here, let's do a comparison. Escape to the Wilds. This is in standard right now. It looks a little bit, like EDH bait, right? Like, expensive card that does a bunch of things, but, it's probably too expensive to see play, but it's actually been pretty good in some red-green adventure decks that just want the card velocity later in the game. And I think Find of a Lifetime might fill a similar role, where you're doing something aggressive, you're playing out your hand, and it's possible for you to run out of gas. But then when you Find of a Lifetime, like that gets you right back in the game, particularly if you have a lot of cheap, high impact things of which you can cast multiple in the same turn. Because if you draw 7 cards at once, you want to start really leveraging that card advantage as quickly as possible, and I think you do that by having a lot of cards you can cast, you know, such that you can cast multiple in a turn. One card that I'd love to see in a Find of a Lifetime deck is Hired Hit. This is the Lightning Bolt variant we looked at earlier. It asks you to toss a card from your hand that you can pay to get back later. But considering you're going to be discarding your hand at 5 mana, hopefully, that's actually better for you. You're kind of stowing it away where you can get it back later, even though you're going to be tossing your hand. Additionally, when you have 7 cards, some of them are going to be more useful than others, and you're going to have the flexibility to pick and choose which ones are important and which ones aren't. Hired Hit helps you play, let's say after this turn you have 6 mana, uh, which is not a guarantee considering you just drew 7 non-land cards. Let's say you only have 5 mana. You could play a 4 mana threat and Hired Hit something, uploading a card that you're you know you're not going to be casting soon because the backlog of cards you want to cast is going to be pretty big after a Find of a Lifetime. Uh, it seems like a card that is going to be incredibly good in some kind of deck, whether it's just a big card advantage dump that you get in a more aggressive deck where you're playing out your hand, or some other kind of combo thing where it cares about discarding cards from your hand or having cards in your graveyard. I think it's going to be good. Number two is Supply Raid, and this is a very fascinating. There we go. This is a fascinating 1 mana targeted hand discard spell. We haven't had those in Custard for a while, other than things like Duress and Despise, which have their, you know, their specific styles of deck that they target, right? They glorified sideboard cards. And they're helpful to have in a format. But Supply Raid, you can take anything. The thing that gives it some texture is that they can get that card back. The problem is with this journey mechanic, the way they get that card back is they have to deal damage to you. I say that's a problem. That's really only a problem for them, not for you. If you cast this on turn one, it's very likely that it's going to be a long time before they can get that card back. And the fact that you can see their whole hand, you can immediately know what the likelihood is of them getting that card back, especially if you cast this early in a game. You can get rid of their 2-drop, and then that might mess up their whole curve, and it'll be a long time before they can threaten any kind of attack against you. The other thing about Supply Raid that makes it so good is that many decks will have no way to ever complete a journey until very late in the game. Think like creatureless control, planeswalker control, things that only have one control finisher, or combo decks that aren't ever really trying to attack you. They're just trying to create a sequence of cards and play patterns that helps them win the game out of nowhere. This card's going to be incredibly good against those kinds of decks. The decks that will not be so good against are aggro decks. If you are on the back foot and you cast Supply Raid, you're really just delaying. Like you're just saying, I want you to cast this on your second main phase, not your first main phase, because they're definitely going to be able to get at least one guy in. So there are certainly matchups where this is not going to be as good. It's going to be a very swingy card, but it is going to be, it's just going to feel like a better Thoughtseize in enough matchups that it's just going to have a huge impact one way or another. That's my prediction anyway. So obviously, it's going to feel like Thoughtseize to some people, except they won't even have to pay the life. One other comparison is Brain Maggot, which is a targeted hand discard that's answerable by the opponent. That's the comparison here, except here it's a creature, and most strategies are equipped to deal with creatures. If you have a strategy that just can't deal with creatures, you kind of deserve to get Brain Maggoted, right? Like, oh, they got a 1/1 that also picked apart my hand. What you gonna do? Uh, Whereas not, it's a fewer amount of strategies that are equipped to deal combat damage. And if you are even a defensive controlling deck against aggro, if you can cast a Supply Raid into like a wall of mysteries, it might be a while before they get that card back. And time is all you need as a control deck against aggro most of the time, until you can get to those big 4 or 5 mana haymakers that give you card advantage and deal with the board at the same time. And then Into the Lion's Den is another answerable uh, targeted hand discard, uh, in that it's like a Brain Maggot, except it's an enchantment, so it's much harder for opponents to kill it. So I think it's better than Brain Maggot in that way, unless you care about the creature synergies. But it costs twice as much, right? So I think Supply Raid might be a lot better than Into the Lion's Den. Again, there's going to be some matchup dependency, but you're not going to be playing Into the Lion's Den against the decks that Supply Raid is bad against anyway, right? Supply Raid is not going to be great against aggro. Into the Lion's Den is going to be even worse, I think. So Supply Raid, I think, is going to definitely have a place in the format. We'll see how it goes. Maybe I am overestimating how difficult it's going to be to get that card back, or underestimating how bad it is if you're behind when you cast a Supply Raid. Like, that is definitely a consideration. Of course, cards like Thoughtseize are also quite bad when you're behind, and yet it's still one of the most powerful Magic cards of all time. So there you go. All right, the number one card I'm excited for, and has already spawned a lot of deck lists in the Discord, is Travel Together, a beautiful white enchantment that creates a lot of very interesting synergies. If you would ever make a creature token, this just gives you an extra token. Now, before we get too excited, just to note, Travel Together is only good if you can make multiple tokens. It's only as good as a 1/1 if you only make one creature token after you cast a Travel Together. So the exciting thing about this is if you're curving out really well and then you're a deck specifically built to take advantage of it, and you have a lot of token makers, because then you can end up making crazy amounts of tokens. And I forgot to put one card, Protect the Farm. That's an enchantment that gives you a creature token anytime a land enters play. Doubling that is really good. Travel Together curves perfectly into Conscription, which is like a slow Raise the Alarm, but you want slow in this case, because if it made both tokens at once, you'd only get one bonus. But considering it's 2 triggers, you get 2 bonus nomads. And then it even has a payoff later once you get to the 3rd level of the discovery, where you can pay through mana to help your team. Boiling Outflow gives you a token each turn, similar to Protect the Farm, like I was saying, or Conscription, except Conscription only does it for 2 turns. Over a longer game, Boiling Outflow plus Travel Together is just going to make sure your board is always full of tokens. The Minister of Zealots is a wonderful red card that gives you a token each turn. It obviously has an aggressive bent, and red-white is a really good color for taking advantage of going wide. So another good combo. Epic of Hanaru is part of an interesting cycle from Scriptures of Urshad, where you can choose which mode, and you can choose, any combination of them up to X. Because it's a different choice each time, you can use Epic of Hanaru to make, 4 or 5 tokens, and Travel Together will trigger off of each of those instances. So you can cast Epic of Hanaru for 5, or X is 3, and you end up with 6 tokens at instant speed. And then it gets even more bonkers, the higher up you go. Whispers of the Antarachi is a very powerful card that hasn't seen play of late. Not quite sure why, just the kinds of decks that are being built. But it has a germinate mechanic. When you germinate, you can either put a counter on something or you make a 1/1. Well, if you choose to make a 1/1 twice in a row, once again, you trigger twice with Travel Together at instant speed. So it's like a double Raise the Alarm for 2 mana, as long as you have Travel Together in play. Well, let's think even bigger. Fungal Whomper. When it dies, how about instead of making 4 1/1s, you make 8? And there's even more. Emrabi and Sunua, a card that has not seen play, but maybe something like this brings it into a deck. Just that consistent token creation gets so much better, and it has a way to take advantage of having so many creatures. Sporeflow Protector we looked at earlier. Again, a consistent way to pop out tokens. Being able to double the amount of tokens you're making. Sporeflow Repulsion, obviously just a limited card, but does it actually have a place in a Travel Together deck? It's on color. Being able to raise the alarm and tap 2 other creatures at the same time can keep you in the game. That's a pretty big swing. Avatar of Plume de Vol is... I'm not even quite sure what happens if you have both Avatar and Travel Together in play and you start making tokens. I think, Travel Together adds 1 and then you double the total with Avatar. I'm not sure. I'll have to check with the rules people on that. But you can start doing some really ridiculous stuff if you get to the point where you have Avatar and Travel in play. So those have been the just some of the many, many cards that are going to be new to the format this next year in 2020. I'm really excited to see what decks people put together, really excited to start playing. If you're new to the format, there's a lot of resources for you. I'll be doing a few more videos about just different decks I'm finding. I'll have deck lists and talk through what my thinking is there. I hope you guys enjoy the custom standard format moving forward. I know I'm excited for Stoom and all of the changes that have been made to the other sets. Anyway, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the custom standard Discord.